Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to season 3, episode 7 of our Association Leadership Series Legislative Update. This go around, my name is Craig Vaughn. I'm the Chief Financial Officer and one of the founders of Castle Group. And I want to welcome back Donna Berger of Becker. Donna, how are you?
I'm doing great. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be back here, Craig.
Fantastic. Nice to have you. And I do love doing these webinars because it's the only time at Castle I'm referred to as an expert. Otherwise, I just signed the checks. No, I'm kidding. So we're excited to get going this afternoon. We've got lots going on. As a reminder, Donna is here just to provide her opinion, not specific advice for your association. So don't look for specific guidance on what's going on for you. We're going to use polling again today, and we'll get started in a second to find out who's listening. And I guess, Nez, if you don't mind posting poll question number 1, we'll find out who we have listening to us today, Donna. And we're going to cover today 5 different things, I think, on the agenda. The first is the latest from the recently ended legislative session, the current regulations regarding inspections. We want to talk a little bit about reserves, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. We got a lot of questions from our listeners with respect to the changes going on there. And then if we have time at the end, answer any questions. So Marinez, let's see who we have, if you don't mind posting those results. So Donna, wow, a high concentration of condos and co-ops today. I think there was some expectation there would be some changes to the regulations with respect to condos, and I think that's probably why. So let's jump right in. We have a lot of things to cover. Donna, we had high hopes for the legislative session this time around. Nothing happened. Thank you for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you next week. No. I think I would say lunch bag letdown. Like we didn't see a whole bunch, but so tell us what happened. Like, let us in.
When you and I scheduled this webinar, right, we said we're going to have so much to talk about because in the aftermath of the Surfside tragedy, the Florida Bar convened a task force, Miami-Dade County convened a task force, Broward County convened a task force, and there was input around the state, okay, and recommendations were made for significant changes regarding engineering, regarding reserve funding, reserve studies, you name it. What happened this session? Well, I will tell you this, our Florida legislators have no one to scapegoat on this issue. The fact that they failed to pass not even significant safety reforms in the aftermath of Surfside, but no safety reforms, it's shocking. I mean, and you know as well as I do, Craig, that there was no organized pressure from any group in terms of opposing safety reforms. Everybody wanted to see things change and nothing happened. Although our legislature did manage to pass this bill naming strawberry shortcake the official dessert of the state.
No.
Let that sink in for a second. So joking aside, this isn't a joking matter. Legislation should be an incremental process. It's not an all or nothing game because it's not a game. I'll take you back to the days before Florida had a Clean Indoor Air Act, Craig, and people said it's not going to happen. What they did is they took little bites at the apple each year, and over a number of years, Florida emerged with one of the strongest Clean Indoor Air Acts in the country. It's so unfortunate that some of our legislators this year thought it had to be an all or nothing game. And also this speaks to the fact that in Florida, historically, anything pertaining to condos or HOAs or cooperatives, our legislators have seen those proposals as a headache. So they lump them into all one bill, which we call an omnibus bill, which typically exceeds 100 pages. And it's a straight up or down vote. There's no line item veto. So if you don't like one thing in the bill, it perhaps won't pass. And we've been saying this for a long time. And even the media has gotten this wrong, failing to understand why bills pass. You may have 5 great things and 50 terrible things. At the end of the day, this bill passed, what we call the Surfside bill. It passed the Senate 38-0, but the House blocked it. One particular representative, from what I understand, Daniel Perez, said that he wanted a fully funded mandate for reserves. And some legislators wouldn't agree to that. It's unfortunate, but we'll see. Oh, I should say this is an election year, so this is not a surprising result.
Donna, what did the Senate pass? That was, where did they had overwhelming support for their proposal, and what was it going to do? Because we're going to come back to this issue again. I'm certain, right, from a legislative standpoint.
Right. Well, listen, the Senate, what the Senate passed was a bill that was stripped down to nothing but the milestone inspections for all intents and purposes. It had removed the reserve funding component. It had removed the requirement for reserve studies. It removed the mandatory board education. So it was already a very pared down bill, Craig, at that point, but it still wasn't enough to overcome the objections in the House.
And that's your bite of the apple, you're saying, like, address that issue, go to reserves next year, go to some of the other things in future years, right?
Yeah, how about that? Or how about you start out of the gate recognizing that you can have a purely standalone bill on association issues, particularly with something as significant as engineering reports.
And why do they do that? Like, I don't understand. I keep in mind I'm Canadian.
The headache. Because these bills are the ones where they hear from their constituents. So
right.
And I don't know how much of that, Craig, is reality and how much is just their perception. But they say, you know what, rather than having 6 condo or HOA bills, we'll just have one large one. That way we'll get fewer emails, fewer phone calls. But, times need to change. Mm-hmm. And that's going to require a significant change in the way our legislators look at these proposals. The number of people living in shared ownership communities in Florida, this is a significant percentage of Florida's population. They really missed the ball here. They really did. And they did a huge disservice to people living in thousands of condominiums and homeowners associations throughout Florida.
And Donna, what was just give me a quick summary of what was in the House bill? Everything, right? That was the whole challenge?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, listen, there was some difference in terms of one of the bills would have allowed an alternate funding source, Craig, for reserves, such as a line of credit. So there were, one bill had the mandatory board education, one did not. But again, this is what happens as they wind through the committee process. Typically, they coalesce at the end in one bill. This really was just a question of intransigence at the end and refusing to allow. It was an all or nothing approach, which doesn't work, particularly when you're talking about life safety issues.
Well, and there were other life safety issues on the table. We had a bunch of questions on any impact on ELSS or any of that, type of other safety arguments.
Nothing happened with ELSS, and if you're listening today and you have still not, you're a high rise, an older high rise, a pre-92 high rise, and you do not have an engineered life safety system, you're running out of time. You've got till January 1, 2024 to have it all in. So you better make sure your funding's in place. As you know, engineers now are hard to come by. We've got a supply chain issue. So I would urge you to speak to your counsel. But if you're hoping for more legislative time to install an ELSS, you're out of time.
Well, it's interesting in that, and I can tell you, we had an engineer on a couple of sessions ago, and they are all jammed with work. So to get, you need to start that process, to your point, now if you haven't already, because I think that they may kick the can again, but you never know. Donna, what did pass?
Okay, you have 2
other
minutes.
Than the shortcake, other than the strawberry shortcake.
2 minutes, we'll talk. So what did pass? There was a Senate Bill 438, and that added to that basically said that the U.S. Space Force branch of the Armed Services was added into the list of flags that can be flown. By the way, have you seen their logo? It's actually a pretty cool logo. I actually looked it up. It's like 6,300 members of the U.S. Space Force. So that's a significant thing. There was a MARTA bill, which is the Marketable Record Title Act, and that addressed the Calusa Trust case. So if you're a homeowners association listening and you're an older homeowners association listening, speak to your attorney about that new bill, which is 1380. They passed a tax relief package for Surfside victims. Craig, they passed a fund for the victims' memorial. There was a bill on construction liens and a bill on service of process. But I mean, we're really reaching here. These are bills that have a tangential impact on associations. So really nothing much, because again, you put everything in one vehicle in an omnibus bill and that bill tanks, you're not left with much.
Right. Was there anything else that didn't pass that you think? I think there was some expectation around insurance reform. There was, What else didn't? But let me backtrack for a second. What else didn't pass?
So let me go back. So the big bill didn't pass. The ombudsman had a proposal. So the ombudsman proposal failed. That would have added homeowners associations within the ombudsman's purview. It would have created an appeals committee and added homeowners associations to the arbitration process. There was a bill, Craig, that would have eliminated fines in HOAs. At first it said you couldn't lien because, in a homeowners association right now in Florida, the board can lien and ostensibly foreclose for fines that exceed $1,000. So that bill was looking to take away the rights of homeowners associations to do it. There was a construction defect bill, which was Senate Bill 736, which really have to say riled me up. Because you can probably tell I've had too much caffeine already this morning, but that bill riled me up because, again, this is the new landscape in the aftermath of the Surfside tragedy. And we've got legislators that proposed and we're trying to pass a bill that would have significantly shortened the statute of repose, which is currently 10 years. And that statute, Craig, is the outermost time that somebody can pursue a builder or a developer for defects that are what we call latent defects. They're not readily observable. And I'm shaking my head trying to figure out why, in the aftermath of a building falling down, you would be entertaining a proposal to make it harder to go after builders. I mean, safe buildings. This was going to be the tagline for this session, for the 2022 session, was going to be safe buildings. What do safe buildings start with? The people who build them. So thankfully that bill failed, but it keeps coming back. And I don't know what it's going to take to wake up our legislators. That, guess what? The laws we have right now to provide consumers with rights to ensure that the construction they're purchasing is safe, keep it that way. If anything, enhance it a little bit, but certainly stop chipping away at it. And then lastly, there was a vacation rental bill, House Bill 325, Craig, which once again would have preempted local regulation of short-term vacation rentals to the state. And so for those of you listening, what does that mean, preemption? It means it would take away the right of your local government to decide whether or not and how they want to regulate short-term vacation rentals, Airbnb, in your community. And obviously the most local regulation, Craig, is your HOA or condo or co-op documents. Right. So I'm not in favor of preempting on vacation rentals, because every community, every local government is different. What makes sense in Miami might not make sense in Orlando, might not make sense in Jacksonville. So that's what failed.
And so, and then other things weren't considered. So I know there were some questions about term limits, education for directors. None of that stuff even addressed, right?
No.
That's it. Do you think, Donna, in your expert opinion, there's a chance that they could call a special session to revisit this? Or is it going to wait a year?
I don't know. If there's enough outcry, listen, we know one thing. Our legislators are most legislators, all legislators are very reactive. They're very interested in getting reelected. So it really does depend on whether or not they get significant pushback for having whiffed this session and not passing anything. I will tell you that a lot of them are tired, even though it's only a 60-day session. Folks, in some states, it's a full-time job. In Florida, it's 60 days.
Right.
So, and I know there's committee weeks leading up to it and everything else, but this is not a full-time job. Look, I know we're going to talk about the MiamiDade ordinance. It might depend on your local government passing these regulations in the meantime until next year.
I think you made a great point. It's an election year. For sure, I don't think, from my sense, there wasn't a lot of resistance to the requirement to have the safety stuff done. It was the issue of reserves, which is a very, very political, very on top of everybody's mind. Like, what's going to happen for these buildings that don't have any money? And if you start forcing those decisions, those financial decisions on people, it does cost you votes sometimes. And I think that's a great point that you made. Okay, let's go on. So no new guidelines with respect to safety, with respect to inspections, with respect to reserves. But I think it would be worthwhile, Donna, to go back through what the current kind of regulatory environment is for. Let's start with inspections and then let's jump to reserves. But sorry, before we get that, Marinez, I'm going to skip to question 3, poll question 3. It's a 2-part question. when was the last time your association, sorry, one part question. When was the last time your association completed an inspection report? And while our listeners go through that, Donna, will you bring us up to date on kind of where we are with respect to the current regulatory environment?
Sure. Well, we have 67 counties in Florida, and there were only 2 counties, Miami-Dade and Broward, that had requirements for 40-year certifications. And that was part of the task force recommendations. Remember, I mentioned those various task forces was, hey, this should be uniform. Why is it more important for a Miami-Dade older high-rise to have this inspection and not one in Collier or Lee or anywhere else, or Orange, or anywhere else in the state? So right now, we only have 2 counties that require, when a multifamily building reaches its 40th birthday, to have an inspection, which is an engineer comes in, they look at the structure, they look at the electrical, they look at the plumbing, they issue a report, and then they send that report off to the county. Now, it's important to understand, Craig, that it really depends on your engineer. So that these counties and cities are not sending out their own engineers to do these inspections. And you mentioned before, it's hard to get engineers right now. We've also learned, everybody after Surfside was rushing. Some of these buildings were at 45 years, 47 years in Broward and Miami-Dade. And the county and the cities in Broward and Miami-Dade had never sent out a reminder saying, hey, you need to get your inspection done. It was kind of like put it on them to remember it. And guess what? Boards change hands all the time. Managers come and go. So these cities and counties really need to make it a priority now to stay on top of the inspection dates. The Surfside bills we talked about, Craig, would have required, if you were anywhere 30 years and 3 stories or higher, an inspection, what we're calling a milestone inspection. But if you were within 3 miles of the coastline, that would have dropped at 20 years. You needed that inspection and more frequent engineering. Now, when you say other inspections, look, buildings are getting inspected all the time, right? There's routine inspections. You pull permits. When you pull permits, somebody comes out to inspect. Sometimes it's, this, Craig, there's some unhappy people living in these communities, right? Somebody who's not happy, they may pick up the phone and call the local building official and say, hey, we've got a problem here. So you've got people coming out to inspect for code violations. You've got the fire marshal coming out routinely to inspect the fire systems and may notice something else going on in your building. So there are still routine local safety inspections taking place, but nothing along the lines of a uniform system that we had all hoped for.
Well, I think it's a great point, and really it leads right into Miami-Dade going off on its own because they're getting no direction from the state. So for the listeners, Miami-Dade recently, I think, adopted some new rules and guidelines with respect to inspections and reporting. Donna, can you give, certainly for our Miami-Dade listeners, it's very real. And, some of the other counties are copycat counties. So you never know what might be coming your way. Can you let us know what's going on in Miami-Dade?
Sure. So Miami-Dade passed a new ordinance, and it's going to require condominiums, cooperatives, and homeowners associations to disclose certain financial and structural information. So I want everybody to hear that again. In Miami-Dade, if you're living in any type of shared ownership community, condo, co-op, or homeowners association, this applies to you. By January 1st of each year, all Miami-Dade associations have to file what's a written registration with the Department of Regulatory and Economic Resources. We call that RER. So I'm going to break it down for you quickly. There's a couple different categories. The first is administration. You have to tell them your name, your address, emergency contact, which I found is interesting for an association. List of officers, website, corporate seal, governing documents. Then financial status. You have to tell them your budget, provide your budget and audited financial statements. Now that one's interesting because what if your documents don't require an audit? And under the statute, remember the statute has different levels for the budget, whether you're reviewed, compiled, or audited. This to me indicates that regardless of how small your budget is, and if you don't meet the auditing requirement under the statute, in Miami-Dade, they're asking you for audited financial statements. So speak to your association attorney. And then lastly, building maintenance. They want a list of planned capital projects, structural engineering reports, and a certificate of insurance. Now, of course, somebody has to pay for all this because they're going to create a public online database that purchasers and owners can tap into So they'll have some idea of what they're buying into. By the way, I actually think that's a really good idea. You want people to have access to know, what are they buying into? What does my building look like? Is it fiscally healthy? Is it structurally sound? So the registration fee for communities with 25 units or less is $50. Seems okay. And if you're larger, it's $50 plus $1.50 per unit.
What, sorry, so I understand correctly, they're not requiring inspections, but they're requiring you to make public the information if you have one. Is that?
That's the way I read it. Yes, it's not a requirement that you do it. It's you have to provide this information.
And is it January 24 is the first year?
Yes. No.
January
It's January 1st. It's 2023.
Oh my gosh. Okay, well, that's what we have to look forward to in Miami-Dade, certainly. Donna, getting back to inspections, and again, we really hope that there'd be some kind of mandate. What do you think is the right? You're in a community. What do you think the right time frame to have an engineering report done?
I think you need to ask an engineer. I think that's an engineer's question. As attorneys and managers and volunteer board members, we are not equipped to weigh in on when you need to inspect your building. That is a question that every association should be asking their engineer. By the way, if you're an association and you don't even have an engineer, start looking for one. But this is what you need to say is, how often do we need to do this? By the way, I'm so glad you asked that question, because you know what happens in every building? People renovate their units, right, Craig? Mm-hmm. They go in, especially in an older building, you get new people in and they want to redo the kitchen, the flooring, the bathrooms, everything. A lot of associations, the only thing they're looking at when it comes to those interior unit renovations is whether or not the contractor is licensed and insured. That's it. Guess what? You need to speak to your engineer, because the board should have engineering requirements for those interior unit renovations, because those renovations, if they go badly, can have an impact on the building overall. And I don't know how many associations have really thought through that.
It's a great point. And we our take is an engineer is one of your other key partners in managing your association. And so, you have an attorney, you have an accountant, you have a management company, and you have an engineer, and you have an insurance agent. Like, those are the professionals that you need to help, guide you. And I think it's unfortunate that safety gets traded off against cost a lot. No one wants to spend the money to do an engineering report. Well, it's an expense, a cost of living in a condo, a cost of doing business in a condo or an HOA. That's kind of our view, and certainly subscribe to what you're saying.
And who doesn't want to do it sometimes, Craig? And this is the most crucial first step in the process, is newly transitioned communities. Okay. Mm-hmm. So you've just taken over control of the association from the developer. And sometimes I hear from boards, well, we don't really want to spend that money. It's crucial that you get an independent engineering report as soon as you've taken over, because you need to know, you need that line in the sand. Are you dealing with a construction defect or a design defect? If you don't take that first step, because as you said, you're being penny wise and dollar foolish, that can come back to bite you. Because if you have a construction defect, you need to have that developer fix that defect or pay to have you fix it.
Yeah, well, and that's the beginning of the relationship with your engineer. Like, you have to have that. You're going to have an engineering study done at some point, certainly at now 7 or 10 years when the statute of limitations ends. So that's a good time to start that relationship. Anyway, so neither of us are engineers, but we certainly recommend that you have one. Donna, let's move on to, let's post the results of poll question number 3, Ness, if you don't mind. When was the last time you had an engineering report for your building? So, well, that's
great.
Interesting.
Some people have had it in 40% within 2 years. That's fantastic.
I think that's fantastic too. And, I think what you find, who's listening in on our webinars is people who care and are doing the right things in their communities largely and want to get educated. So I think that's a great endorsement.
Craig, I hope the 16% never are HOAs that only have grass.
Yeah, or they don't know. I don't mind that I don't know. Okay, let's jump on to reserves now. So quickly, Nez, will you post poll question number 2? Let's go back. This is a 2-part question. Does your association rely on a reserve study to determine required reserve funding? And when was the last time you had a reserve study? little bit different than an engineering report, not as comprehensive, but isn't looking at everything, but nevertheless drives the reserve. So let's get into the concept of reserves, topic of reserves. There is nothing, as I understand it, there is nothing in the legislation, in any of the statutes regarding the requirement to have reserves, correct?
That is correct currently. Currently, association boards are not required to hire an independent reserve study.
By the way, fair enough. And then help us understand the legal requirements relative to reserve funding, i.e., if I understand correctly, a condo board has to adopt a budget with fully funded reserves. They can elect to allow the owners to vote on reserves. And I don't want to practice law. I don't want to cross that line here, Donna. So maybe I'll turn it over to you and you can give us the legal requirements.
So let's start first with what you mentioned about reserve studies. So you don't want to do a reserve. You haven't done a reserve study. So when I talk to a client, I'll say, okay, where did you get these figures? Well, Ed, the treasurer, came up with them. Okay, how did Ed come up with these figures? By the way, sometimes there's a treasurer listening to us. I'm not impugning you, Ed. You may have great insight into the numbers, but the reality is, and we've talked about this throughout all of our webinars, Craig, I've talked to you, and when James hosts, it's having a safety net for your board. You don't want to be on that high wire as a board without any sort of safety net beneath you. Having a reserve study is your safety net because you've got actual people that come out. By the way, there's two aspects to a reserve study. There's the financial aspect, and then there's the structural aspect of going out and actually inspecting the components. So if you're not using a reserve study, you have to ask yourself, what are you basing these figures on? Okay. And also, are you adding in an inflationary factor, which I will tell you most people don't. And even many reserve studies don't, and that's a real problem. So when people say we're fully funded, and okay, when's the last time you had a reserve study? 6 years ago, and there was no inflationary factor. You are not fully funded, okay?
Right.
Not nearly fully funded. And I think our legislators' confusion on reserves, Craig, is part of what tanked the bill, and part of what even the proposals that were drafted had problems with them, because they really underscored a fundamental lack of understanding of reserves. So I'll throw that out there. Hopefully, if there's any legislators listening, work with some experts and before you draft the bill next year, because there were problems with the bill. In terms of what you asked, statutorily, condos and Florida condominiums and cooperative boards have to pass budgets with fully funded reserves, with the reserve schedule for roof, painting, paving, and any other item for which the deferred maintenance or replacement costs exceeds $10,000. So in many communities, that could be like a seawall. Okay, so they do that for seawalls. Sometimes they do that for elevators, things like that. In an HOA, it's a little bit different. Homeowners associations, the statute does not have those same mandated statutory reserves, because many of our HOAs, they're not responsible for roof or painting. They've got green areas, they have a gazebo, they've got, so they don't have that. In an HOA, if your developer created the community and the documents require reserves, then you have to fund those reserves. They're treated the same as a 718 reserve. Or if your owners at some point vote to implement a reserve. For instance, in a lot of my HOAs, they have voted to implement reserves for items like guardhouses, Craig.
And what, by the way, it's funny you talk about inflation, which was non-existent for the last 10 years. So but it's now a real factor. But getting to there, we certainly agree with you in that, it's hard to defend the reserve numbers if you don't have a professional looking at it. That's kind of our philosophy. And we really recommend every 3 years, you have one done, and then the reserve companies will come in every 3 years and just update it for you. So, to have a look. And again, that gives you a real good basis, because I think the worst thing that can happen, we find, is an association thinks they're fully funded. They go to do the roof repair and they realize they have half the money they need. So everybody goes up in arms because you said we were fully funded, but now we're not even close. And I think if you have, again, a professional looking at this, you're going to be in a much better position.
But Craig, to your point of, we're going to see these bills resurface next year. Absolutely. And again, because next year's not an election year, right. We believe that there will be changes with regard to reserves, with regard to engineering studies, engineering reports. So stop putting out a vote to waive reserves completely, it's going to be a problem, at least partially fund. You know, one of the proposals would have increased the percentage to waive. It was going to increase it from right now, it's a majority of members can vote to waive reserves. It would have increased it to 2/3. In
Right.
some of the proposals we saw, it was a complete, fully funded mandate. Again, not well drafted because it wouldn't have even resulted in fully funded the way it was drafted, but it would have been much more robust than what we have right now. So your owners can vote to waive funds, waive reserves, or they can vote to partially fund reserves. Here's what they don't vote on. They don't vote on fully funding reserves. That's your board's duty to adopt a budget if you're in a condo or co-op with fully funded reserves. So sometimes I see they put it out where the owners have to vote to fully fund reserves. That's the default position in a condo or co-op.
Right.
And your board has an option to say, we're just going to put out a vote on partially funding, let's say 20%, 40%, anything, as opposed to doing a vote between waiving and fully funding. There's some middle ground there.
Yeah, and quite frankly, they don't even have to give the board, the community, an option to vote, right? There's a way that the association can force that, but they don't have to even provide that option, do they?
That's true. I mean, I have communities that don't. I mean, if you've got 10% of the owners call a special meeting and put it to a vote, but really that rarely, if ever, happens. So
Right.
The board can make a big impression on the members in terms of how they want to handle the operations fiscally.
Yeah, we have a number of associations that don't fund reserves, much to our chagrin, but that is the strategy they've adopted. And sometimes over many, many years, they just, there is a tool for doing, raising funds, which is called a special assessment, which no one likes to talk about. But, there are those associations. And I think the challenge that you have is getting those guys to convert. You have a couple of good opportunities to fully fund reserves when you first take over your community. Because if you don't start, it's really hard to catch up.
It's very hard to catch up. But listen, the reality is there may be people that can no longer afford to live in some coastal communities where the maintenance needs are higher.
Yeah.
They've waived reserves, they've kept the assessments low. And the reality is some people may need to look to move elsewhere. The good news is the market is high right now. And it's a terrible thought, but you can't have the tail wag the dog.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, and I think the other time is we do have associations that they find themselves doing huge projects, 10, 12, 18, $20 million work because they, and borrowing the money and figuring that all out. But that's another good time to reset your reserves. You've just, you've redone your roofs, you've done your balconies, whatever it happens to be, to say, okay, we're not going to do this again.
Here's where it gets really irritating, Craig, when we're dealing again with the government perspective on this. Do you know the first condominium ombudsman in Florida was quoted in the Sun Sentinel, I think it was back in 2005. He came out against funding reserves, saying that it would be too tempting for boards to have access to that kind of money. I mean, those are the kind of mixed signals that we hear. It's just.
But yeah,
let me start it.
Yeah. Okay, well, on that topic, before we move past reserves, let's just show the response to our poll question, which was, does your association rely on reserve study to determine required funding? A lot do, which is fantastic. And then when was the last time you had a reserve study? Can you scroll that down so I can see? 43% in the last 2 years. So 73% in the last 5 years. Those are good numbers.
Yeah, they are.
Those are good numbers. Well, good for you guys. Okay, let's go on to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and their entry, their volley into the whole Surfside and condo repair business. So before I get there, we got a whole bunch of questions on this, Donna, from our listeners. But can we post poll question number 4, Ness, please? Is your board or manager filling out the new Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac questionnaires? And Donna, this is pretty new. It just came about kind of in July. We're just really starting to see it now. But can you go through this? Give us your thoughts. Maybe even go through some of the questionnaire questions and just how absurd and difficult they are to answer from a board and manager standpoint.
Well, let me start out by saying that legally, the board is required to provide an estoppel certificate. And as you know, the form that estoppel certificate form was changed 2 years ago to include additional information. But that's what you're legally required to provide. What's owed on the property.
Right.
Other than that, there's always been these lender questionnaires, Craig, where the banks have tried to make managers and volunteer board members like quasi loan risk officers for them, like do our due diligence for us and let us know if making this loan is a good idea. I was never in favor of those even before this lender questionnaire on steroids that Fannie Mae adopted on January 1st, Freddie Mac adopted on February 28th. So those questionnaires, let me read, I actually do have it here. So one of the questions is, did the last inspection have any findings related to the safety, soundness, structural integrity, or habitability of the project's buildings? Do you see a problem with a volunteer board member or a manager filling that out, or even a lawyer? By the way, folks, if you think your lawyer is going to fill this out, we will not. I'm speaking for myself, but I think a lot of my colleagues share my thoughts. This is an engineer's question, okay? I have been advising, don't translate. I wouldn't want somebody translating my legal advice. Don't translate an engineer's findings. You need the engineer to say whether or not his or her inspection revealed findings related to the safety, soundness, structural integrity, or habitability of the project's buildings. Here's what you can do. The owner who is selling can request a copy of the maintenance records and any and all engineering reports, and that owner can then provide that information to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or the lender in question. You don't need to be the middleman. Guess what happens to the middleman? You get squashed if you get it wrong. Another question is the HOA cooperative corporation aware of any deficiencies related to the safety, soundness, structural integrity, or habitability of the project's buildings? How do you answer that? The report itself may not be clear. You may not know. You may look at the report and think it's fine, and you may be misreading it. How do you know? Again, the banks should be looking directly themselves. I hope they employ people. I know they have lawyers. They should be looking directly and determining whether or not this is an issue. I love this question. This is the last one I'm going to quote, Craig. Is it anticipated the project will in the future have violations?
I know.
Again, so what many of my clients are doing is they're passing a policy saying that we will provide what's legally required and we're not going to provide anything else. Now, I know what happens for the managers listening. You get, when there's a closing, you get a series of escalating hysterical emails and calls related to these questionnaires. I understand that. By the way, I did real estate law before doing association law. I did closings. I know how it goes. But once you have the policy, it kind of shuts it down. Then the question becomes, is the board in any way being an obstructionist? Are you stopping a sale from happening? You get that a lot. Well, you're not helping. Guess what? Many of these closings take place anyhow. And there are some loans that are held on the portfolio of the lender. Remember, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are not making direct loans. They're buying them and they're guaranteeing them on the secondary market. There are lenders out there that make these loans. They're called non-warrantable loans. They hold the loans on in their own portfolios. They're not looking to sell or guarantee them on the secondary market. So there's always going to be a market out there. You know, Craig, as well as I do, lenders have always threatened, even with regard to like the safe harbor, when we wanted to make them responsible for more past due assessments. Well, we're going to stop making loans in Florida. That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
They're always going to make loans. So speak to your counsel. You know, CAI has weighed in and has urged Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to put this on hiatus, to come up with more reasonable questionnaires. You know, the $150 you can charge to fill out this questionnaire is nothing compared to what the potential problem could be and the potential liability if you get this wrong, even if you've got that language that says you're filling this out in good faith and to the best of your knowledge. If you get something wrong with regard to the structure and safety of the building, that's a problem. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac should know this, that this is overreaching.
I completely agree. And it is a complete overreach. And we take the same position at Castle. We've basically said, first of all, lawsuit information, because I think that's one of the questions, is in a public record. Like, go figure it out. Like, do your homework yourself. Same with the inspections. They're filed with the state or the cities, the counties, wherever. But this is a past liability. This is a big liability pass here. I mean, I think they want the information, but they also want to be able to sue somebody if their loan goes bad because something happens. And I see if you post the results of the poll, is your board or manager filling out the new Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac questionnaires? Yes, 15%. So cautiously, we would hope. No, 58%, 33%, 58 out of 175. But I don't know is a big number. And it's probably because I think it passed in July, right? Is when the new questionnaires came down. So
January 1st is when Fannie Mae adopted it. January 1st, Freddie Mac, February 28th.
So it's just brand new, listeners. So you're going to start to see this. We're seeing it. I really like your adopt a policy because then you can point to the policy.
Stops the chatter. If you go back and forth, it's just a series of badgering. It vacillates between badgering and pleading. And I understand people want to close, but these questionnaires are very problematic.
For sure. And if they're almost offensive when you read them and what their expectations are. So again, tread lightly. Donna, we have some time for some questions, but I had one for you in that, what do you think we should be talking about for next year's legislative session? What's on your wish list? We've got, we're gonna have the inspection list. We're gonna have the reserves, but I'm guessing you have an opinion or two about what should be addressed by the legislature.
Oh boy, Craig, you sprung this on me. I normally do have a legislative wish list. Well, first of all, I'd like to see before next session, as I said, I'd like to see a complete philosophical shift in our legislators in terms of sponsoring and shepherding some standalone bills. I think an engineering bill next year, standalone, is incredibly important. I do think reserve funding is important, but only if it's drafted in a way that makes sense. Okay, not what we saw some of this session. Boy, in terms of wish list items, look, again, it's not easy sitting on a board, right? It's not easy. So anything we can do to clarify, our statutes are so bloated, and 718.111, 718.112, there's things in there in those sections that you can't even imagine that it would be there. It's like having a car and a refrigerator and talking about the two things in the same paragraph. This doesn't make sense. One of the things that we've talked about for years, other states have adopted the Uniform Common Interest Ownership Act, UCOIA. I don't know whether or not that's a dream that would ever be realized in Florida, but boy, that would be nice, wouldn't it, to have just a streamlined, like with our associations, it's one thing to keep adding on piecemeals or what we call spot amendments, or just come up with a brand new set of documents. Yeah. I honestly have to tell you, my wish list is probably throw out the statutes and come up with a brand spanking new Common Ownership Interest Act.
Yeah. Be smart. Act with use common sense. Whereas everybody agrees.
How about even just drafting the statute in a way, and this is probably bad for my profession because you have to call us to try to make sense of these bloated statutes, but draft it in a way that it's written so people can actually understand what it's saying.
Donna, we did get some questions on limiting liability for board members and how they can mitigate their liability, their risk. I mean, the bottom line is if you follow the rules and do what's right, you're probably well protected as a director. But what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody who actually serves on the board. Okay, it's never been more difficult than it is today to serve on a board. I think I've said this in past webinars. I served on my own HOA board for 2 years, and it wasn't fun. You're dealing with your neighbors, you're dealing with people on the board. It's not a fun job. I would first of all make sure that you have sufficient directors and officers coverage in place. I would also look at your documents to see what the indemnification clause provides. Every set of documents, Craig, has an indemnification clause, which basically says that if a director gets sued by virtue of sitting on the board, the association must indemnify him or her. But not all indemnification clauses are equal. Some require a board member to lay out cost of defense and then be reimbursed. That's a very different scenario than having the association insurance cover you, or if it's not coverable, having them to cover you directly. So that's number one. Number two, show up. Don't just get on the board, not show up, or get on the board, show up, and not play an active role. Too many boards, and this is true in the past, where you've got one, maybe two very vocal, very dominant directors, and the other people are sitting there, and they may in their head not agree with what's being done, but they don't speak up. You can't afford to sit on a board and not play a role and not be heard. Okay, you may be on the losing end of a vote, but at least you'll know what's going on. And if you're not comfortable, then you always have that option to get off the board until you can make some real changes. So that would be my other recommendation. And then thirdly, look, understand what it means to have a fiduciary duty. When you sit on that board, you have a fiduciary duty. We saw that during the pandemic. People were threatening and complaining, but you're on the board. You have potential liability. The person who's saying, open it all up or do this, they don't have that fiduciary duty. You sitting on the board do. So understand the nature of fiduciary duty and make sure that you're able to put the association's interest above your own always.
I think we spend a lot of time in meetings, and you made a great point about voice your opinion, and not everything has to be unanimous. Like, that shouldn't be your goal, right? It's probably not working if you don't have a dissenting opinion in any decision. And we watched a lot of meetings where board members tried to convince other board members that their opinion's wrong. Just vote. Like, we all have an opinion. Let's listen once, and then we don't spend an hour in a circle saying you're wrong because, or those types of things. So vote and be prepared to not have a unanimous decision. That's fine. That's how it works.
And I'm doing a lot of board member codes of conduct, Craig. I'm sure Castle's doing that too. That's very helpful, because a lot of times people get on these boards, they don't know what their role is. Nobody, there's no onboarding really for board members. You just get elected, you're doing the organizational meeting 5 minutes after the annual meeting closes, and you're off to the races. But nobody really sits you down and onboards and says, this is what the treasurer's job entails. This is what a director's job entails. So those board member codes of conduct, and listen, you can draft them however you want. Talk to your attorney, figure out how you want it, what ground rules you want to establish. But it's very useful to have policies and protocols. If you're sitting on a board and you're worried about potential liability, the answer is policies and protocols. You should know at all times where your source of authority to do things flows from.
I think, and we're seeing just so much emotion in communities these days, and it's reflected in the questions we get asked and the meetings we go to. And code of conduct is a great way to get in front of it. We put it in our board orientation. It's in our when we kind of welcome new board members to the communities we manage. We have an orientation, and we kind of set of guidelines in terms of how you're expected to behave as a board member. Again, you don't have to agree with me, but we're not going to get into a heated argument about me not agreeing with you, on a board meeting. And we certainly are getting a lot of that. And frankly, we're having associations adopt those types of things for their conduct in membership meetings or board meetings where the residents are participants. It is very true. Okay, I want to jump to a couple of quick questions from people who have written in. Do you see a revision or reduction to the timeframes for the filing of a lien on delinquent accounts in a condo coming in? The famous change last year.
Do I see a reduction? You mean rolling it backwards? Rolling it backwards? No. And this is another problem that we have at the same time that the legislature is primed to add a lot of significant expenses onto association members. There seems to be a complete disconnect of how those services get funded. They get funded through the collection of assessments, either regular assessments or special assessments. So on the one hand, you can't continue to impose new fees and costs, whether it's paying for a reserve study, paying for periodic engineering reports, the necessary maintenance and repairs. And on the other hand, now you've got associations waiting, you send out, as Castle does and other management companies, you send out your first late notices, 1, 2, maybe 3. By the time it gets to us, now it's 45 days for the first demand, and then we've got a lien. I mean, you're months out. You're months out. Meanwhile, one of the proposals in the Surfside bill was you had to have repairs done within 6 months of the report being received. And if you didn't, one of the proposals said it could go up to $5,000 per day for penalties. So again, I really hope there's one or two legislators listening to this webinar, because I really don't know how you do that. Do I see it being rolled back? I would hope that I'm going to add that to my wish list item. I would hope that they would rethink how all these safety mandates are going to be funded. If you, on the other hand, you're making it harder and harder, and you're delaying the time period to collect these assessments.
Yeah, I agree. I'm with you on that one. It's too long a period at this point in time, I think, and there's too much bureaucracy in it. Do Fannie Mae forms apply to HOA sales and condo sales? Yes, I think that's the right answer to that question. I saw one here on the funding. Where's the funding of? Oh, the waiver of reserves. Do you have to? No, we answered that question, I believe. I think there's a question, Don, on you get a reserve study done. Do you then have to put those numbers in your budget?
Well, that is a great question. I actually had that come up. One client had 2 reserve studies. They liked the numbers from the 2019 study better than the 2021 study. Look, I think you know the answer to that. Directors can have potential liability, personal liability, if they act in bad faith. What would be your reason to reject a reserve study numbers? Okay. And especially if you're going lower, I think there's a potential bad faith issue there. Look, if you got numbers and you weren't certain, do a peer review, hire another reserve study and compare it.
I think the other thing we recommend is sit down with the engineer. Like, maybe their assumptions are wrong. If you don't understand their assumptions. So make sure you understand the assumptions. And the whole reason to get someone else look at it is so you have what are objective numbers. So you strip off the emotion from we can't afford it to let's make a conscious decision. If we can't afford it, let's go to the owners and figure out if we're going to waive reserves, whatever we're going to do, another plan where we can save. We have a question about the cost of reserve studies. They are all over the map. We had a reserve specialist on a month ago, and he said there's a lot of factors: the number of amenities you have, how many floors if you're an HOA, you have 2 pools, you have 5 pools, you have cabanas, tennis courts, those types of things. So it's really amenity based. And then for condos, again, it's really unit based. It depends on what they're looking at, especially when you get into the concrete issue. So I have a lawyer answer for that, which is a non-answer.
It's like everything else. There's good reserve companies. There's not so good reserve companies. I have seen these cookie cutter reserve study templates. And one time I had a homeowners association HOA client, and they did the study clearly with a condo template because they referenced common elements, they referenced units. It was a problem. So you really do need to do your due diligence when finding a reserve company. I want to take a quick step back though. For the person who asked, hey, we get these numbers and do we have to use them? You have to always picture yourself sitting on a witness stand and explaining to a judge, well, Craig, Mr. Vaughn, why you had a reserve study and it said that these were the numbers, you discarded that. Why? You better have a good rate, better have a really good answer for that.
I completely agree with you. Donna, we did talk a little bit about inflation. There's a question from Andrew. Is it true that Florida legislature restricts allowing for inflation in reserve budgets? But I don't think they don't have to do reserve studies at this point. So there's no real restriction.
No, well, I think the restriction that person is referencing is the restriction, and this came from the division on balloon payments with pooled reserves. And again, this is confusion on the division's part about what a balloon payment is. And I think that's where there's nothing in the statute that restricts inflation. As a matter of fact, I hope, again, I'm going to go back to what you said, a wish list item would be I believe if you speak to a real reserve specialist, he or she is going to tell you, you need to add in an inflationary factor. And hopefully we will see that in legislation next year.
Yeah, I agree. How do we address a board that does not care to ask for contractors' licenses and insurance when the owners are remodeling units?
I talked about that earlier. And if the board's not insisting on it, then vote in a board that will.
And make sure you have the rules that require it, right? I mean, that's the other procedures that require them to file that information.
In some communities, they don't require it. Boards take a hands-off approach. They don't even do that. I think that's a terrible mistake. But if there's a requirement that they do this and they're not, then arguably they're in breach of their fiduciary duty, and there are consequences for that. If it's not even a requirement, and you just think the board's not listening to what the community wants, then vote in a new board that does.
Agreed. Well, Donna, we're kind of out of time, and I wanted to thank you very much. Any last comments before we wrap up here today?
Well, are we still on? I'm seeing a thing.
No, the thank you is coming, but we're still on.
Okay, great. I want to thank everybody for joining us. For our legislators, do better next year, please. And for everybody else, stay safe. Know that some of the changes we talked about this year, I believe they will be passed next year. So there's no better time to start preparing than right now.
Excellent. Well, Donna, thank you always for your guidance. We really appreciate it. To everyone who checked in today, thank you very much. Thank you for what you do, and we'll look forward to talking to you next month. Take care. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye now. Thanks.